the effect of
all of that. First, take us through the understanding of Nigeria's market, the oil and gas industry. Are we getting it right with this move?
Well, thanks so much. I think it's a big question that you asked, but if I just take it back a little bit. So when we go back 4 or 5 months ago, if you argue, PMS, 600 naira per litre, something like that. So heavily subsidized without a doubt, especially if you think about the fact that when the importers bring in the PMS and it lands in Lagos, the true cost, the landed cost of PMS at the time was about 1,200 naira per litre, call it that. If you go to the pump, it was being sold for about 600 naira per litre. So that's quite clear, a huge amount of subsidy. Now, whether you like it or not, it was something that was untenable. And I listened to the guest before. He was making assertions to the fact that President Bola Ahmed Tinubu was forced into this and all of that. And that's really nice and good, but it's not here or there. The reality of it is subsidy payments have really gotten to the point where Nigeria had to do away with them, whether we like it or not. So going back to my point, it was 600 naira the pump, 1,100, 1,200 landed cost. And then we went to the whole point where, again, it got hiked up to around, so to the 860 mark, which is where we were a few weeks ago. And finally now, 2 days ago, we saw it go up to 898, and then right now I think over 1,000. Now, the reason for that, the reality of it is, the market today is being completely liberalized. Free market forces of demand and forces of supply are going to take charge. And what you will be paying at the pump is the true landed cost of petrol. We haven't had that before. Since 1972, believe it or not, since 1972, Nigeria has been importing PMS into the country and having some sort of subsidy here and there. So the problem is being about, it's about a 52-year-old problem, this whole subsidy importation problem. In today's world, there's an opportunity to solve that problem with the Dangote refinery producing all the way in Lekki, right here within our shores. We're going to have that coming through, through lots of tankers and all of that stuff, all the way into our cars and all of that. Would have one surety of supply without a doubt, because it's here. All the logistical challenges can be taken care of. We can be guaranteed that we're not going to buy adulterated petrol. In the past, we've had that situations where you put it in your car, you have an explosion. We can be guaranteed about that. But I think fundamentally, the reality of it is we are in a situation right now where the market has been liberalized. Free market forces have taken charge. Now, I'll say this, I know it's very painful. There's no question about that for Nigerians. But the reality of it is where we were before was not a sustainable place. Where we are today is painful, but I think this has to be done for us to have any chance of in the future.
I like that. Energy security is key here, and you will agree with me. But let me ask you, many would say, is it right to leave all your supply or to depend on one source of energy for a country? Some analysts have said it's not really safe. So do you think that, or how do we address this? Yes. What do you make of energy security for Nigeria?
Great question. Energy security is a really important one. And when we say energy security, let's just, make that very clear. Before you talk about securing anything, first of all, you have to have it. You have to have it, so you have to access it. Okay. Now, if I just focus on just having it, could we say in the last 1 year that we actually have had petrol? Do you see what I mean? So the point I'm making there is we do have the crude oil off the shore of Nigeria, but the reality of it is with all the importation and the subsidy regime and all of that, we've never had it. You go in queue. I mean, one of the studies just done recently by some of our analysts made it very clear that the average, believe it or not, the average taxi driver in Lagos spends about 3 days a month just queuing for petrol. So what I mean is if you put all of the time he spends about 72 hours cumulatively just queuing for petrol. So think about that. That's a huge problem for an economy. Why? Because that man contributes to the economy, provides a service to the economy. But now that man is stood idle in the petrol station. He's not contributing to the economy. So you have downtime and all of that. So the point I make here is, to your point about energy security is really important. But first of all, you have to have it. And the system we had before did not guarantee that, because you have all the importation, you have all the weather issues we talk about, and all the excuses that we had, and many of the petrol stations were not serviced and the queues were massive and stuff. What we have today is we have a refinery, $20 billion. Okay, a huge investment that will guarantee the security of supply. It's a given because you don't have much of the logistical challenges that you'd have there. It's right there in Lekki. It's being evacuated through lots of tankers, but also some barges right now. That's the next phase of it. So when you talk about energy security from accessing petrol, many of us, those queues should go over time. Over time, they should go, especially if you have Port Harcourt producing as well, and other refineries. Then we should see them. Yes, to your point, I completely take it. Having a single point of failure, because this is what this is basically. It's a single point of failure. If something happens to a refinery, then we're back to square one. Okay, and I think that's the challenge. So there is that part of it. But the reality of it is, before we talk about energy security, you have to have it first. That's question one. And then when you have it, then the next question becomes, can you afford it? So access to energy, affordability of energy, then the security of energy is number three. So to the first question, can we have it? I think potentially with this new refinery, we can have that energy. Can we afford that energy? That's a big question. That's a big question. Okay, and then sequel to that, can we then, secure that energy? I think it's a different ballgame.
It's getting more interesting. Now, the supply from the report I got from the gantry loading report, it shows that the Dangote refinery is yet to meet up supply expected from the NNPCL when they had the off-taking agreement. About 27% is what they were able to meet. But my question to you really would be, the demand is high. We're talking about 40 million liters on daily basis. Some have argued that we need to also check the volume and be sure of our consumption level so that we don't over project, something like that. I don't know how that comes to you.
No, that's a great question, anyway. So you've said a couple of things, several things in one. But let me just reiterate. The first thing I'd say is, if you go back 20 years, maybe 15 years ago, Nigeria's consumption, daily consumption, if I just focus on PMS, so just premium motor spirit, so this petrol, was approximately 21 million liters per day. So if you go back about 15, 20 years ago, that's close to where we are. At that time, there has been a growth, there's been cumulative growth rate because of population increase and all of that stuff. Over the time, approximately 7% per year. Okay, so in today's world, just using that projection, you're right. Approximately 35 million, liters of PMS, or 40, something of that sort is sort of the number. But if you look at the numbers that we're getting back from the importers, in fact, in some cases, they project 60 million of daily consumption, which sounds a bit artificial. 70 million of daily consumption, which sounds, rather artificial, especially if you look at the cumulative growth rate, that we had, like I'm describing there. You go back to, sort of 2010, 2011, 2012, talking about, around the 20 million liters per day, compared to where we are today. So there is a bit of an anomaly. Over the last 10 years, there was a jump of almost 50% increase in the daily amount. And it seems a bit artificial and something that nobody can quite wrap their heads around. Now, I'll say this. With this new refinery that has come, the production is in Lekki. Okay, they will load it in the gantries, which you mentioned about in Lekki. I think, I can't remember now, I think something like 40 tankers can load, at a time. So 40 tankers can load at a time, and each loading takes about 40 minutes. So huge amount of tankers, I think about 3,000 per day that can be done on that front. So all of that's done there. Dangote has put on trackers on each of those lorries, basically. So we will be able to track over time the amount of liters consumption, real consumption in Nigeria. So far, it's very opaque, and it's opaque for a particular reason, because you're giving subsidy, and most of the places in the world, when there is subsidy, is prone to these kind of opacity, where you're not quite sure, because people pad it up. It's just how it works, rather, unfortunately. But to your, I think to your first question, I forget what the question is now, but I think you asked a question around. Pardon me. I think yeah.
There were two questions around supply and also for the Dangote refinery to meet up the demand, expected demand. The report we have shows that it's doing about 27 to 30%. Yeah, that was my question.
Right. So that question, I must say, honestly, that's not my understanding. So as far as I see it, there are several things that have been put out in the media. Several numbers have been put out in the media with regards to this, which I know for a fact because I'm talking to people on ground, that's incorrect. Dangote Refinery is not doing 27%. It's way higher than that. It's operating at the moment about 60 to 70% capacity. About 60 to 70% capacity that the refinery is operating at the moment. In fact, the last number that we got was about 31 million liters of PMS that's leaving the refinery. 31 million. Okay, so if you going back to your point, if the daily consumption of Nigeria is approximately 40, I'm using the upper number because some people think it's about 35. It's about 40 million liters per day. And Dangote is doing 31. So you can imagine the delta there is not very much. Okay, it's a very small number. But I'll say this: there's several people who have been putting out several numbers out there to justify additional importation of bringing products from outside. But the reality of it is, got this investment is $20 billion. Okay, this is by somebody who's indigenous. I'll put it to you this way. And you asked me a broad question around oil and gas. Honestly, there have been very few people who have put in that amount of money in Africa. There have been very few people, not even big corporations. Here we have this investment on ground. I honestly think, in my opinion, something like that should be designated as a national asset. The refinery should be designated as a national asset. Why? Because you depend on it to get to work, and so do many people depend on it to get to work. It's a bit like the discos and the gencos. Most of them right now have been privatized. The whole transmission and distribution infrastructure in Nigeria has been privatized to different people, but they are national assets. Why? Because your house depends on it to get the electricity that you need in your house to perform all the functions that you need to do. In the same way, I think a refinery like that that's responsible from getting people from A to B, from home to work and work from home, needs to.
All right. Okay, before I ask you my next question, let's take a break. We're going to continue our conversation. Our conversation is still on. We have some live feeds from Ogun State, where the Marine and Blue Economic Minister, Mr. Gwego Yetola, and others, they are there for the foundation laying ceremony of the state's inland dry ports, proposed dry port city, Shoderu village, Ilori, around Papalanto, Irekoro, local government area of Ogun State. We'll be having live feeds from there, but we'll continue our conversation live on TVC News on all other platforms. Stay with us. All right, now, Dr. Chinnan, now let me ask you before you go. Now, what to you is the outlook of the entire global oil market, considering what we've seen and what is happening in the Middle East? Many are worried that the price of crude might go higher, and if that happens, we know what it means for us in Nigeria. But what's your general overview of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great question. It's a really good question. I think most oil analysts, as you can imagine, are standing with bated breaths because, there's a huge potential, huge risk, actually, that, crude oil as we know it might jump, very significantly. And the reason for that is several fronts. You go back over the last few months, we've had lots of situations where, there was a signal from Saudi, yes, that they would not up anymore, they wouldn't sustain the cuts that have been up for the last 2 years. So we had a bit of an uptake from that, standpoint, but also, all the wars that we see around. But I think particularly right now, in today's world, the biggest risk, without a doubt, is Israel's response to Iran. So everyone's waiting with bated breaths to see, one, the mechanics that Israel deploys on that front, what they attack, how they undertake the attack, and what the consequences could be. And I'll run through a few scenarios. One of those is Israel has been looking to hit some of the oil supplies of Iran, refineries, but also, a couple of things around the Strait of Hormuz. So that's that strait just by Iran and Oman, as you can imagine. So if that happens and there's a direct sort of a strike on oil facilities, the problem that you'd find here is this, that honestly, crude oil might jump at a minimum, and you can quote me on this, at a minimum, $30 per barrel. Okay, we'd have a very, 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 very significant jump in the price of crude, perhaps, over the $100 per barrel mark. That would happen the moment supplies are constrained, if there's an attack. But sequel to that, they're also looking at the nuclear sites of Iran, the nuclear program, whether that's the appropriate thing to do if they strike that. Now, each of these scenarios carries a particular type of weight, because if that happens, there's a huge risk that Iran will also look at that and say, okay, we're going to go next level with it. And if that happens, there could be very, very significant consequences without a doubt. Now, actually, just to add here very quickly, you would have seen about a couple of days ago that there was a bit of an earthquake in Iran. We saw that. Now, many analysts have also been speculating, and I don't know if people have seen this, that earthquake could have been a nuclear test. Now, I'm saying it is speculation that people are making there, that it's sort of underground because there was an earthquake. People are saying there was a bit of a test. It's not entirely proven, but the whole point here is it just puts a lot of uncertainty in, sort of in the atmosphere where we are today. Hopefully, none of those does happen, and Israel holds back or is sort of reticent in its sort of response.
Way to leave it, and I must thank you so much, Vice Chair, African Energy Council, Dr. Chinnan Dikwal. Thank you so much. We hope to have you again soon and being a regular on our show. We appreciate this.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thanks so much, Tim. I know.
Interesting conversation there.